AI coding tool that you love to use. And we'll also use the skill that we built out to help build this framework and all the files needed to bootstrap these assistants and ship them to your VAPI account. And then what we'll end up with is, at the end of this example, we'll have 4 assistants, all with different prompts and voice configurations. And we'll cover that once we get to there. So let's build it. Starting with bootstrapping the fleet. So like I said, we'll start with that rough draft. Typically, you can use AI to maybe talk about these use cases and come up with a simple script. And in my experience of building these assistants, I actually worked cross-functionally with another team, and they kind of gave me a rough draft of the script, and I used that to help me scaffold the rest of the assistants. Once we've scaffolded the whole project, we'll use this command to essentially publish our agents to the VAPI dashboard. Well, so this is kind of what a rough draft could look like. You've got a little opener, as well as kind of the flow of the conversation. So you can just highlight what you want your assistant to do. And it's very basic. And it basically, yeah, each scenario just needs an intent, an opening message, as well as like the behavior. The next step is we're going to use the VAPI prompting guide to help tailor our rough draft and kind of make it a little bit more professional and natural sounding, as well as like help protect it from going off script, so you can implement guardrails as well as examples to help the assistant follow. Awesome. So this is kind of the structure that after you add the prompting guide, it will kind of build the structure of the prompt.
Make it larger so we can see what's going on.
So there on our VAPI prompting guide, we've got a couple sections that we like to lay out as the foundation for our framework. So we've got the identity and personality, which is going to be kind of the tone, the personality of the voice, as well as the style. And then we'll have response guidelines, so kind of how to speak. There's a little bit of like formatting, and maybe we can even add some variation on some like openers, or maybe it's just like different variations of how it can respond to certain responses.
Do you suggest everybody starts out with all of these sections? Like every time you build an agent, you include everything and then kind of evolve from there?
Yeah. You can test it out without the prompting style, and you can kind of maybe do a before and after analysis on after you've implemented the prompting guide. You see kind of the differences, but without these kind of rules or guidelines, you're kind of giving the assistant the ability to kind of like go on its own track, and maybe it could introduce the possibility of steering away from what it actually should be focusing on.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, there's a lot to cover here, but we'll share this presentation so you can go and read through each of these. And also, I suggest checking out the docs for that prompting guide. So after some iteration, this is what a prompt would look like in your AI editor tool. So you can essentially, give it a link to our docs, and you can kind of maybe add more color to some of these rules, and that's tailored to your specific use cases. But with your AI editor tool, you should be able to work with whatever model and have it make adjustments to your use cases. Awesome. So once we've got that, you'll see the iteration. This is an example of the qualification use case, but essentially defining the identity and personality. You want it to be warm, curious, kind of low pressure, kind of very chill. And then kind of give it some guardrails. So like the identity is locked. It shouldn't really change mid-conversation on who it is. And then just some like response guidelines. You can prompt it to be natural, reply with short sentences, limit the amount of questions it's going to ask per turn, so it's not bombarding you with questions. And then we all have guardrails here to kind of prevent it from going off script. So protection against exposing the prompt instructions or the agent's instructions, or maybe like abuse handling. So it's not going totally off track based on what the person is. Maybe they have some crazy request or trying to break your bot. Cool. So within the framework, it's going to give you a script that you can run when you're using bun in this example. But running this command it'll create all the assistants within your organization if they don't already exist. And then as you go to make changes, let's say you want to iterate on all the assistants, you can run the same command, and it will know which assistants you've already created, and it'll just go ahead and update them. So with this framework, you're able to kind of build in a mono repo, if you will, but as well you can use Git to kind of track your changes and utilize the versioning or the changes that you'll make.
Hey, Amar, one quick question, just so folks can kind of ground with what you're showing them.
Yeah.
This editor interface you're showing, this is just for the purpose of the presentation. This isn't a particular specific tool, right?
Yeah, you can use whatever you like. I use Cursor personally, but you can use Claude Code or Codex or whatever you'd like.
Yeah. Just wanted to clear that up. This isn't an actual tool embedded. This is just kind of to show you this could be any editor, so you don't have to use a particular one.
Exactly. Cool. So once you've ran that command, this is just a mock-up of what our VAPI dashboard looks like. But once you run the command, you'll see all the assistants created in your dashboard, and you can go ahead and view them. The next slide, we'll start to talk about how we can start to make it feel more natural. So I talked about the prompting guide, but I want to cover kind of just like this little tip that we found when building these assistants was very, I guess, instrumental or positive on making this feel more natural. And so I'd like to call this a response bank. You can call it whatever you want. But basically, instead of giving just one response for the assistant to kind of respond with every single time, you can add a variation. So you can essentially come up with a bunch of phrases where it can respond to a similar question, but have different variations of how it can respond. So that way, when you have callers calling in, it's not the same script every single time. And we found that this just makes it feel a lot more natural. Cool. And then using the same kind of prompting within your AI editor, you can work with your models and come up with these variations and adjust them as you will. But you can see here, we've got like different transition phrases. We've got some filler words. So you can do like or and just maybe have a little bit more fun with it, a little bit, maybe some banter, or just some playful phrases.
Yeah. What's your favorite thing to like add to a voice agent? Like do you like the ums or uhs? Do you like them to be like a little playful? What's your vibe for an agent?
Yeah, I think like the fillers are very natural. I mean, I think it's very common for everyone to have fillers and when they're presenting or talking on the phone. But
some of us have too many.
Yeah, there's a lot. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything in particular, but I would say filler words and just like whatever use case it is, like it's good for the assistant to kind of engage with the customer and maybe like give kind of a witty response. And yeah, make it feel less robotic.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's nothing worse than that.
Yeah. Cool. And so yeah, working with that model, it'll help you make these modifications and you can accept them as you will. Cool. So what the final state of that would look like, your prompt gets updated. We've got a little response bank markdown file. And later down in the flow, I'll walk through of how this framework composes all these markdown files and and puts them together and ships them to your final state. Cool. So this is something that the skill would generate, and is part of the framework, but it's basically a prompt loading mechanism, and so that response bank will be injected into the building phase of the assistant, and so with that you can just essentially any changes that you make, you just run the same command, and it'll run the building of the assistant, and it'll up assistance. Cool. And let's start to talk about the tool call result. So if you remember from the demo, as the conversation happens, there's a card that populates data as the conversation happens. And with that, to accomplish that, we use tool calling. So in the prompt configuration, so this is the lead qualification, we can use prompting again to help us add this tool. So this is basically a short, a decently long prompt that will help me define what I want the tool to do, and then create the configuration for it.
Yeah, thanks.
So what that'll look like, we'll submit that prompt, and it'll help us add this piece of code here. So basically defining the tools to use in this assistant. The tool that we're going to name it is called Capture Lead. It's has the async flag, which essentially just means that it'll run. It will run while the conversation is happening, and it won't wait for this tool call to finish as you're talking to it. So it'll help with latency. And we suggest using this flag for any long-running operations. So once we've added that, we can just run that same command, and it'll update the assistants. And then in the dashboard, you can actually test these calls. So this example that I put together here just kind of walks through the transcript of a live call. But you can see the agent opens with its opening question, the caller responds with the response, and then after that, the tool call happens and it captures the data. And this happens as the conversation goes on. So the next question, the response, it captures what the data should be. Awesome. So we just walked through 6 of those patterns. You can use, we'll provide this presentation at the end of this talk, but you can kind of walk through these patterns on your own, and build whatever use case you're thinking of building.
So I have a quick question, just to kind of recap the whole flow. So to build these homepage agents, you started with, it was kind of like a multi-team collaboration on like, what do we want these to be? And that's where that rough draft came from, right? So you start with a rough draft, and then from there, then it kind of gets passed over to you. Now you're like, as the engineer, you're like, this is my problem to solve now. I have the vibe that we've all decided as like a cross-functional team, what this agent should ultimately be. Now it's for you to say, like, how do I make that into a prompt that's going to capture all of that? So you take that rough draft to a prompt, and then from there, when you ran to get out all of the agent, it fans out to many agents. So you kind of essentially generated many agents from this same prompt.
Yes, exactly.
Cool.
And also handles different languages.
That's,
so yeah.
Okay, so that's kind of where we are now. And up to this point, you're working completely in code, except for the testing, it sounds like. You prefer to test in the dashboard?
Yeah, I'll cover, the next slide, I'll cover the testing portion.
I'm getting ahead of you.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, so like this framework just essentially allows you to build with your favorite AI editors, and you can build it within a repo, so you can kind of track all the changes, and it helps you make incremental changes. But it also just helps like with building the multiple use cases and the multiple languages that you're trying to ship for. Where if you're just building in the dashboard, it's very sequential, and you kind of have to build everything one by one, and it's prone to errors. If you want to share similar prompts, you have to if you have to change it in one assistant and then go to each single assistant and change it sequentially. So this framework
can
just
move
kind of
faster and iterate faster, it sounds
yeah,
like.
you can basically iterate faster, use your favorite AI coding tool, and help it kind of build and change your assistants as you go.
Yeah, but the dashboard's always there for you if there's anybody listening that's like, this like generating from code is not how I like to work. Yeah. You can accomplish all this in the dashboard. The dashboard. You wouldn't be able to generate several agents at once that way. Like if you wanted to kind of like how you generated them all, that you would have to do from code. Yeah.
You'll quickly find that it's a lot of work to just create one, build a prompt, maybe you're like copy and pasting, maybe you're working in Notion and you're
so it depends on what you need, like what your goal is. If you know you need something like this, then maybe starting from code and like the skill that Mar's going to share will help you get there really fast, even if that's not a place that you're as comfortable working.
Yeah,
cool.
Yeah. And to kind of preface, like using this framework, I was able to like get a very quick working example. I think within a couple hours, maybe it was like 2 hours.
I love that. That's crazy. And, like, love it.
Yeah. Cool. So after we built all the assistants, it's a lot of assistants to handle and manage and test. I've kind of thought of, 3 different ways that you could potentially test and make sure that these agents are working the way that you think it should be. So in VAPI, we've got a feature called simulations that's still in alpha, but you can go ahead and try it, but essentially allows you to create simulations or on all the different use cases. So you're able to kind of define a mock conversation or persona and then run them against all of your assistants. And you can bake this into your CI. So every time you make changes, it can just kind of run that same test. But also it can help you, I think in our example, we used it to help test the different languages and make sure that each language is responding correctly. We've also got evals. Evals is a little bit more mature than simulations, but it allows you to define test cases and make sure that when you're changing your assistants, that it will produce the same output and have no regressions as you're making these prompt changes. And then another way to test your agents is you can build like a tester agent, and this kind of requires a little bit more manual upfront work, but it's essentially you build another voice agent that is essentially going to role play with your assistants. And so the way that you'd set this up is you would just define, if I have a use case that I am a reservation, a restaurant reservation voice agent, I would spin up another voice agent that is a customer that is looking to book for a restaurant. And then you can kind of prompt it and give it specific instructions. Maybe if you want to do a happy path, maybe you want to do a bad path, or maybe just some edge cases, you can do so. And you can set it up in our VAPI dashboard where you can call the assistant and it'll just role play.
That's really cool. I haven't personally tried that yet, but it reminds me of how you would test other types of agents, but the voice version where like it's like the LLM is judge at that point. Like the models become just like, then they're just having conversations with themselves, which is really, really weird when you think about it too hard, I think. But that really makes it more effective. And then you don't have to go and manually talk to each one. Because I assume at scale you have so many assistants. It's just you need something more automated to give you some insight into how these agents are performing.
Yeah, exactly. And you could probably use the same skill to help build and scaffold all of the testing voice agents and start to create your own system of how you can test these voice agents. And it's really neat with this example too, is that you can also just like kind of hear an audio version where simulations and evals is just plain text. With the tester agent, obviously it's all going to be voice, so you can kind of just hear what a possible conversation could look like in that audio format. Awesome. So to wrap it up, we've got some resources here to share. This slide, Amanda will send out the link to this presentation. But on the last slide, you can find links to our prompting guide. You can use this command to add the skill to your AI coding tool. There's a little copy button here, so you can just hit copy, as well as some just resources for our community.
Right. Mar, this was amazing. Like, you made it sound really simple. I know a lot of work and thought and care really went into each one of these agents. But this kind of flow of bootstrapping, you can spend the most time kind of fine tuning how these agents feel, how they behave, and that they're calling the tools and have the guardrails, and then you just generate all of them at once. And I think that that's such an unlock for people to be able to really move fast at scale. I think this is such a cool flow. I'm really interested if anybody in the audience grabs this skill, tries this. We'd love to hear how it works out for you. Like I said, join us in Discord. I've dropped the links a couple of times. I'll drop them. I think we have time for a few questions. Do you have time for some questions, Mar?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, let's do a few. So early in your presentation, Chris, I'm going to go with Chris. Your username in YouTube is very long. But he was noting that the tonality on these agents is great. He feels like his agents are a little dry at times. Like, how do you emulate that like warmth? Is that coming from the models, or do you feel like you have control over that in the prompts? Where do you really affect that dryness versus kind of different kinds of tonality?
Yeah. There's a handful of different ways that you can achieve that warm tonality. So in the assistant configuration for the model, there's something called stability, and so you can use that slider. I think it's like 0 to 1.0, and just kind of like adjust. It's different for every voice model. So I would say like as you're testing your assistant and maybe you're playing around with different voices, you want to like just kind of do a couple runs, and my flow is I'll just like change the slider and just run through the same conversation. But I found that like with the setting affects differently based on what your voice, what voice you're using. So if you're using 11 Labs or VAPI voices, there's a lot of variability. So I think it's like just a lot of like trial and error. And then on the prompting side, in the prompting guide, we covered out how to like assign like a tone or like a persona. That helps with kind of the script and what it's going to say. And and then it also just like it goes side by side with the voice as well. So as you know, let's say you choose a warm, fun voice, the prompting will work better with that voice. But maybe if you're using like a dollar, like podcasty kind of voice, it might be harder to prompt for that warm tonality. So I would say like choosing the right voice and then choosing the right settings will get you there.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's a combination of really the starting with the right model for what you want, the right voice model, and that is you just have to kind of research them and get to know the models.
Yeah.
And then from there you have control within the VAPI dashboard, and all the tuning controls we give you, but then also the prompt itself. So there's a lot to it, and I don't know if you're still in the chat right now, Chris. So hopefully you'll see this later. We have a couple more questions that I think will be interesting. Somebody noted, Yoav noted that our homepage agents, these demo agents, the responses were just really snappy, really fast. And he was curious about like how do you achieve that level of latency, like where it feels that real.
Yeah. So on the VAPI dashboard for your assistants, we have some metrics when you choose the voice and the transcriber and the model. So based on your use case, you might have to adjust. Maybe if you need a more complex model, you might use a model like GPT 5.4, or maybe your use case is simple, and maybe you might use a mini model. But a lot of those settings, based on the complexity, will increase your latency during a call. So you just want to be mindful of your use case, and you can utilize our metrics on the dashboard to help you make that decision on what settings to use, and it'll kind of map out the latency for you, and you can go from there.
Yeah, it's another thing. I think a lot of it comes down to when you're developing voice agents versus like when we all make our chat bots. There's just a lot more fine tuning involved and really understanding at each layer kind of what all of these like pieces of the stack kind of
Yeah.
give you, and how flexible each are, and obviously we're doing a lot of work all the time to make that easier for you to just like figure it out in the dashboard without having to be an expert on every model too.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question because we are pretty much at time here, but I'll get one more in where I saw it. Okay, someone mentioned Naeem, another longer YouTube name. She says, or they say, we've been struggling with early end calls. How do you work on your tool call timing? How do you deal with that? Well, especially with when the call ends. Do you have any tips for how to balance that tool call ending so it doesn't feel abrupt or a little too early?
Yeah, so we've got something called end phrases that essentially the assistant will listen for to call the end call tool. And so having very specific phrases for it to look for is helpful. Um, and it's a lot of like fine tuning for that use case as well. So knowing your use case, knowing when to end a conversation, and then defining that in configuration will help you achieve that accuracy.
I wonder if too, I'm thinking like if you notice this when you're already in production and you can kind of analyze like what are the ways that people usually end up ending calls because maybe you can like look for these, maybe you don't realize what phrases to look for too. And like kind of like when do calls naturally end? Is there any kind of pattern that you could follow and then kind of plan for that too? I would
Yeah,
imagine once you have production data, you can learn a lot about how people are interacting
yeah.
with your agents.
And it's mostly on like the prompting. I would say it's mostly on the prompting. Um,
Yeah.
if you can add like a little excerpt of the bottom of your prompt that says kind of instructions on when to end the call,
Mhm.
you can, tailor it to your use case and add some more like color on what phrases it should look for, maybe the vibe. Um, but the end phrases work for when the assistant says, like maybe it's wrapping up the conversation, like have a great day, for example.
Yeah.
You can add that to your end call phrases and it'll wait, it'll kind of it'll wait for it when the voice agent says that, and then it'll invoke that end call tool.
Yeah. I know something I made, and it wasn't for, customer facing, it was for myself, but it was ending early. And I just, for my case at least, I made it confirm with me. It's like, oh, are you really done now? Because like we were going back and forth. It was like a little educational tool. So
Yeah.
it's like, okay, this is what we've done. You're ready to stop. And so I would confirm it. Not the best flow necessarily for every kind, but there's different ways to approach what the end should sound like that'll feel good for your users, your customers. Um, so, Mar, thank you so much. This was really
Yes.
interesting and informative, and thank you for sharing all those resources. For anybody still with us, I know we didn't get to every single question. If you can drop into Discord, if you pop those questions in, I'll make sure that they get to Mar. We'll answer them kind of async after this. Keep the conversation going. I'll also drop those resources in Discord. They'll be attached to this YouTube video. If you joined us late, this video will be available on YouTube, and if you RSVP via Luma, it'll get emailed out to you later. We'll also send out a little survey, just how did you like this, the kind of content you want. If you have any ideas for what you would like to see from us at FAPI, from the engineering team, any content that would help you build better that you're interested in from our DevRel and community team, we would love to hear your ideas. So thank you all for joining us today. And Mar, thank you so much too.
Thank you.
Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Nick Robin, the Principal Product Manager here at VAPI, and I'm here with Iz Shalom from Cartesia. Say hey, Iz.
Hi, it's Iz from Cartesia.
Over the next 35 minutes, we're going to dig into one of the more consequential decisions that teams building with voice AI are making right now. And that is, should you go fully integrated or open stack? And Iz and I both come with a lot of say on this topic. So really excited to have you all here and jump into the discussion. We will take questions throughout the chat or throughout the session today, and then Iz and I will kind of answer a few of the top ones at the end. So drop those into chat or use the Q&A format, and then we'll get through as many of those as we can in the last 10 minutes. So let's get into it. Iz, you want to start off, tell us a bit more, take some time around explaining Cartesia, the history, what you guys are up to now?
Yeah, we are a company that makes models. Specifically, we do voice AI models, both text-to-speech and speech-to-text. We are known for Sonic 3, which is the best real-time voice model, PPS model. Been around for a couple of years. We're excited with about the partnership with Vappy and everything.
Awesome. Glad to have you here. And for those who don't know, Vappy is built for both enterprise and developers, a platform for building production scale voice AI agents. You can think about Vappy as the orchestration layer. So we handle that plumbing between speech recognition, language models, and voice synthesis, plus all the infrastructure around it. So that's telephony, WebRTC, optimizing for latency, and then also conversion management, making sure you know what's happening with your agents. What makes Vappy distinct is we're an open platform, so you can bring models, whichever one you want at any layer. Cartesia, obviously one of our preferred partners at the voice layer. They've been integrated with Vappy since day one. Our partnership goes way back to kind of co-hosted hackathons and in basements and empty warehouses back in the day to now full first-class support for every single new Cartesia model. And we'll talk a little bit later about what that looks like in practice for using Cartesia with Vappy. On deck today, we'll talk a little bit about kind of why voice AI architecture decisions matter and why now. Then Iz and I will open it up to just kind of a free-flowing conversation from our experience, what we've seen, what decisions you should be thinking about when you put through models for vendors here. We'll leave you with a few pros and cons around different, whether integrated or fully open, and then answer a couple of your questions at the end. So let's jump into it. Why now? Why are you here today? Why should you care about this? Well, the voice AI market is growing quickly, and we have these two business imperatives that are starting to converge. We have operational efficiency, where voice agents are able to drive down cost or call at scale, and then customer experience. And for many, your customers, voice is still probably the preferred channel for high stakes interactions. I think what's awesome about voice agents is they're able to even further improve those interactions while maintaining a low cost per call, because you have these voice agents who are always available, they're always at their best, they're never cranky, and they can be fine-tuned and trained much easier than a fleet of human resources maybe answering your calls. And I'm sure some of you on the call today, you're maybe feeling the pressure to accelerate the performance of these metrics with voice AI. I think we've seen around the industry, we're seeing new updated company goals, leadership mandates become more agentic, more AI-pilled, and that general pressure to put AI at the forefront of your business. We think voice AI is a really great solve if you're kind of responsible for owning either or both of these metrics. So what else is happening right now in the market? This chart is from Meter, and what it's doing is measuring kind of the complexity of tasks in an estimated time to complete, where AI models are able to handle them at 80% success. So if we rewind kind of back to where we started, GPT-2, GPT-3, really GPT 3.5 kicked all this off. These models were only able to handle tasks that lasted a few minutes. In 2022, GPT-4 pushed that into kind of a handful of minutes, and by Sonnet 3.7, we were seeing 5 to 10 minutes. And I think now anybody who's using Opus or O3 or any of the kind of deep thinking models, 20, 30 minutes, even up to an hour on some of these. I know I've had long running agents doing work for 45, 50 minutes. And the point in this isn't which model is winning. It's just pointing that models keep getting better. And best in class today is not going to be what's best in class 18 months. This is something we've seen play out repeatedly, and this chart is a great example of that. Kind of one of those key reasons we want to bring top of mind why locking into a specific architecture can be a pitfall in building your agentic voice solution. Now, just one more chart, I think I promised the last chart for today. This is Grand View's research on enterprise LLM market forecast. And the number that I kind of want you to focus on here is that 41.6 billion by 2033. You can see that text-to-speech to text markets alongside this. The opportunity is even larger. One of the fastest growing categories in this is domain-specific LLMs. So we're starting to see general purpose LLMs give way in some cases for more specialized models. whether that's built around specific industries, tasks, acoustic environments when we're talking about
Another
voice.
paper towel
And again,
for
that
me.
pattern is playing out at
Another
every
paper
layer,
towel.
not just LLMs, but voice-specific text-to-speech for naturalistic language, medical and legal ASR trained on domain vocabulary. As this whole area expands, we start to see things that are more and more specialized, and in some cases may make sense for your use case. So this pattern isn't new either, right? I think if we look back to kind of this cloud boom, AWS launches, opens the floodgate, everybody's thinking about building on cloud. Within a few years, there's 100 cloud providers, big and small. You start to get providers building on top of that, where you get things like Heroku and DigitalOcean. And then by 2012, 2013, 14, everything is like totally cloud native before a rapid consolidation, which leaves kind of a couple players, right? So I'm sure most of you are building on either an AWS, Azure, GCP, or some other tool that's built directly on top of those. The survivors here weren't the most feature-rich vertical solutions. They were those that had the most flexible open infrastructure. And teams that had locked into specific provider stacks often found themselves maybe stranded when that provider lost its edge. And when we look at this kind of AI boom now, I think that losing the edge is becoming now something that happens in weeks instead of maybe months or quarters, right? So, you know, GPT-3 opens the doors, thousands of AI startups flood in, new model comes out, we start to see those who are tied to a specific model start to get squeezed out, and those that were able to kind of keep that flexible open infrastructure kind of maintain pole position here. So with that, I think we kind of look at like two ways to build here, right? There are these integrated where you have a single vendor, full stack, pre-packaged together. And this certainly has its pros, right? It's simpler, faster start, best for certain narrow use cases. And then you have that kind of best in class at each layer, right? Something that's flexible, composable, future-proof for those more complex, evolving, or multi-use case deployments. And with that, I want to kind of jump into the discussion topic for today is like, how should I be thinking about using my voice stack, right? Is my use case better suited for this one vendor full stack, or do I need to look at something best in class with full flexibility across each layer? So for that, let me bring in you, Iz, again, and let's talk a little bit about this. So just to kind of open that question, how should I be thinking about building my voice stack?
Yeah, I think you kind of summarize it well. If you're just getting started and you have very confident that your use case is relatively narrow, sometimes it's tempting to go and go ahead with a single provider, just do everything through them. Everything is kind of integrated. You can time to value might be a little shorter, so it's not that long either way, but it might be like a really quick way to get a proof of concept out there. If you're in a company that's trying to get a funding for a certain project, that might be a really easy way to do a little demo. That's powerful. And then in some cases, very big enterprises want to kind of contract against a single company. That's another kind of use case where the integrated, we see kind of people gravitate towards integrated. And then the OpenStack modular is sort of the flip side of all of that. If you're trying to go the distance to build multiple use cases or to build for multiple languages, then it's really helpful to have the choice on every part of the stack. And kind of for the benefit of the audience, maybe it's worth talking about really quickly about like what are the three components of a voice AI stack, which is the text to speech, which is what takes a text and turns it into actually like the agent speaking. This speech to text, which hears the user and then transcribes it, and the orchestration, which is kind of where what Vapi excels at. And in each one of those, there are sometimes different best of class dependent on the usage. So if you're thinking about going the distance and building the absolute best thing out there for your users and having the flexibility to change things down the line, then modular OpenStack winds up being better.
Totally. And I know maybe some folks on the call don't have an idea of if they're going to be able to go the distance or where they're going. Sometimes you start with something really small and want to scale into it. I think this discussion is still super relevant for that because as you start building, you hit gold with a proof of concept. Like you said, you're starting to pitch investors. This does start to hit some ceilings with this, kind of single solution. And you'll need to start thinking at least through your roadmap. What does your kind of future infrastructure look like as you, do continue to go and scale that up. You mentioned kind of the cascade or the waterfall of like speech to text, LLM, text to speech, right? And I'm wondering like maybe just for this audience again, what are some kind of key metrics or benchmarks that people should be looking at each layer of that, or things that maybe you guys are thinking about at Cartesia?
Yeah, for sure. So for STT, I mean, the king is the word error rate, and it's just making sure that you're transcribing everything correctly. On LLM, I mean, we have absolutely so many benchmarks, and I think that's the thing that varies most. Actually, with between different use cases, you can use different models, different prompting strategies are good for different things. I would encourage everyone on the LLM to create their own evals and to do that as opposed to taking like a basic benchmark. And then text to speech is again, you can look at word error rate, but actually the king of the hill there is what's called MOS, mean opinion score, which is you look at between two different MOS or head-to-heads, or those are, we find it also to be incredibly helpful to just compare one voice to another. Yeah, and then of course, like the thing that matters to us at Cartesia, and I think to VAPI also, is the latency, because no matter how natural your voice sounds, if it takes 3 seconds to respond, it's not gonna respond well. So the end-to-end latency, what's called a voice-to-voice and kind of like round-trip latency is what matters most, and it is dependent on all these components. If your speech to text doesn't do turn taking well, you're going to see it in end-to-end latency. If your text to speech is like slow and you're going to see that in latency. And yeah, like those benchmarks are tracked. We see, what are the benchmarks that you're kind of like looking at when you're evaluating different providers, Nick?
Yeah, I think you nailed a lot of them, right? We use a lot of the general ones, but the biggest to me is like how this all fits together. And you mentioned it, we had kind of talked a little bit before we got on today around like this kind of advertised latency and then observed latency. So one thing that we look at really closely is like, yes, this provider or your chain of providers may at P50 operate with this latency, but at production scale, you're really worried about that P99, right? You want to make sure that any single user is not having a turn that takes 10 seconds or 5 seconds or even 2 or 3 seconds to complete too. So I'm curious with that, like kind of how do you battle test some of your models to make sure that the advertised and observed latency are kind of as close as possible?
It's a great question. As they say, in theory and practice are the same. In practice, they're different. Everybody comes out with their sort of P50 latency, and which has to do, oftentimes it's kind of these cars where they get their emissions get evaluated in a very certain setting,
Yeah.
And then in real life, like it ends up being a graph, right? Like a graph of latency that the people observe, and we stress test our models. So for us, it's not just an endeavor in modeling, which is of course part of it, but a really deep endeavor in inference engineering. We track it like really closely in production. What are the P90, P99s, etc. That's what we want to deliver on. And we hear it, like we hear how bad the customer experience winds up being if the P99 goes to like some crazy number. It's like one way to look at this is like if the latency is above a certain threshold, call it 3-4 seconds. It's as if like the agent has dropped. Like the experience is so abysmal. It's like as if the agent has dropped. So we really think about that deeply, and as part equally important part as all the like MOS metrics or WER metrics, etc. Like the latency is part of the product.
Yeah, and I'm curious, besides latency, like when we talk about that being a problem or an issue that gets exacerbated at scale, like what are some of the kind of other ceilings that folks may hit? You're in a single provider, you're ready to scale to 1 million calls a month. Like kind of what are some of the concerns that you hear come up from your customers in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely there are quite a few. Sometimes people start and they find that like okay, the one component of the whole stack isn't working as well as they need. Like the speech to text isn't doing like medical transcription well enough, so they need a different solution. They want to go to a different provider. Sometimes we find that they want to use different languages, and they have the things that work well in English don't necessarily work well in like Spanish or in like in Vietnamese, right? And you can't. It is actually surprisingly difficult to evaluate a provider on how good their certain language is. So, people, especially smaller companies, they're not going to go ahead and benchmark all 42 languages for hallucinations. You just get started with what you need to get started on. So that's where kind of thinking two steps ahead and retaining optionality for yourself winds being helpful, because as opposed to like if you're a big company, then you might have time like an RFP process. You might have like 6 months to evaluate end to end every single vendor. When you're just getting started as a startup, you do not have that luxury. So that's where optionality is being matter. But like, I'm actually curious, kind of for you guys, like what do you see where people come and be like, oh, like I thought I was going to be able to go to the distance with this platform, and then they're like, all of a sudden they find something that doesn't really work.
Yeah, I think one thing is it's kind of like almost the flip side of what you said, where it's like at a startup scale, it's like okay to use the most intelligent model or like the most expensive model in some cases, whether it's LLM or voice too, right? And then like when you scale it at production, we see customers do testing and do evals, and in some cases they'll realize like actually we get similar conversions at a just slightly less powerful or maybe a less natural voice. And, they play with a lot of these levers too. So I think one thing that's interesting is, you're at your, startup scale, you're doing a couple hundred calls a month and the cost is not really a big problem. You scale that up to 100,000 or 1,000,000 calls a month, and suddenly now you have a huge problem on your hands with costs, right? So I think what we see is some customers looking to like optimize some of those levers, and where can they still, of course, find the most natural, highest performing agent, but at a cost that like ultimately fits their business model too. And I think, like you said, like optimizing across each layer of that stack allows them to do that. So just to give an example, like we may have some customer who will use VAPI and kind of our squads feature where you're chaining multiple agents together to have some high intelligence agents for really critical or high complexity task, and then some lower complexity agents when it comes to basic FAQs. What time are you opening? So we'll hand the scheduling off to something that's really, really intelligent and maybe at a higher cost. But for the basic FAQs, those can be routed to an agent that is a bit more economical for that use case. So yeah, some of the stuff that we've seen kind of over the the billion or so calls that we've done. I want to maybe just change gears a little bit. We had kind of talked again in our prep around like building your voice stack integrated versus this open thing. And I think one hesitation I hear from folks about building fully open is like they lack the expertise to do it, right? Maybe they don't have the engineers who have the voice experience, or they don't know where to start building with AI. Like what have you seen with that, or like what may be your rebuttal to that kind of fallacy?
I think it's actually, there are providers out there, including Bapi, which allowed building this in a relatively self-serve way with relatively little technical acumen. You do have to make a couple more, maybe like some things don't come as baked in by default as like a sort of fully wrapped up, but it's something that. I think the bar is a lot lower than what everybody thinks, and you guys are doing everything you can to lower that bar further so that you can get to something early quickly. And I would say when you're just getting started, kind of the motivation. I guess what I'm trying to do is give people what is the motivation to spend that extra 2 hours today to get something started for something that doesn't provide immediate value to tomorrow. And what I would say is that like you kind of don't know what you don't know at that point in time, and it's the you from 3 months after might thank you.
Yeah, and I think one other thing too that I hear is like, maybe we don't have the experience building agents internally, and I think for that I would just say like, get started building, right? I think we're just seeing that like agents will be the solve, whether you're using voice agents, coding agents, customer support text agents. I think like one thing is just getting started with building SIS is so huge so that you can kind of build some of that expertise internally. So
100%, 100%.
Cool. We've kind of talked about like differences in LLMs, and we talked about some of the description, but what about like the text to speech side of things? And we know that not all text to speech models are optimized necessarily for the same thing. where do you see teams making the wrong or hesitating on model choice, and what does that like kind of end up costing them?
Yeah, I think it's easy to get swayed by the benchmark. Sometimes people look at like there are different arenas out there, and people look at oh that's the best one, and they just like let me just use this, or that's the one that I've heard about. Let me just go ahead and use that one, which works fine at the beginning, but then there's all these other things that we've discussed. Well, what's the latency? What's the breadth of choice around voices? What is the stability? Somebody in chat mentioned like hallucinations. It's actually like especially if you go to as you go to more esoteric languages or like more not even like super tail languages, but Portuguese. As you're going to those, it's another thing to think about. Like, what is the multilingual performance? What again? Latency, multilingual performance, domain-specific performance. How can you do the proper pronunciation across different domains? All are things that need to be kind of considered, and of course, you want to make an initial decision quickly and move forward. But we see people kind of come in to swap their TTS providers based on these things, and of course, as you mentioned, cost. What's good for a proof of concept and good to get you to like a seed or a Series A. As you start scaling, where the cogs don't matter as much. As you start scaling, you have to start thinking about, especially in longer running calls, like how much you want to be paying.
Yeah, and you mentioned kind of the different languages there. Like, what are your guys' perspective on like different languages or like different models by language or using general purpose models? Like, how do you guys at Cartesia think about building support for language?
Yeah, so we're very big on multilingual. We think kind of not just a lot of this industry ends up being very U.S. centric. We take a different kind of lens at the world. We know that there is 1.5 billion people in India who speak 22 different languages, and that's one place we have affinity to. But just generally, we find that these more tail languages, and they're only tail languages in sense that there aren't existing models. There's a ton of speakers around there.
Yeah,
We believe that they need to be served really, really well. What we find is that the performance of a model in one language provides very, very little guarantee in the performance of model in another language. So we are like you almost have to evaluate it as two separate models. So almost on every on every language, it needs its own evaluations and everything. And we find that it's quite hard to trust any provider really without you having evaluated it or without having like very, very deep track record. So that's it's hard news, but that's the reality.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I look at this or I'll talk with customers and, it'll be a really challenging problem. And it's just, some of this is the reality of like the technology is still being figured out, right? And like, we've made these massive advancements in the last few years and like, maybe we expect too much. Sometimes I think I go back and forth on this. Like, should I be expecting more from my model or less? But I think, like you said, some of it is just like we're figuring things out. Models keep getting better, but there's still a lot of like human evaluation or human review of like the inputs and outputs to these to make sure that at production you can get comfort over using it. And certainly I know you guys have done that and you've been championing like kind of having the right harness and having the right evals. Could you talk a little bit more around that? Like what things maybe should we be evaluating for? What are like 2 to 3 must-haves before rolling this out?
Yeah, I mean, in a world where the models change so quickly, it's important that you have like really good harnesses, both for production and for the evaluations. You want to get to a point where you see there's a new model that promises to be better. Like the ideal situation, we have some sophisticated customers who are at that level, where we'll tell them, "Hey, we have a new model. Give it a try." Within 24 hours, they run the model. They know exactly if it's better or worse to their use case. They have a very tight metric on what that entails. Usually, it's kind of like containment rate or something like that, and they have a very tight answer, and that just allows them to be that much faster. If they have like a really, really tight harness around all of this stuff. But I mean, obviously, kind of the orchestration level is kind of a harness of its own. But I'm curious what you see from your side. And I know like Vapi also has like tools around evaluating how well the calls went. Like, how do you see people use those tools to evaluate new models?
Yeah, I think you mentioned like containment rate is a big one. Ultimately, like task success rate of like, what was the kind of user calling in for? Did they get that solved? And then like customer satisfaction is another one too, right? We want to make sure that like we're solving these problems at a lower cost per call, but we want to balance that customer experience too. We want to make sure that like we're not just totally degrading that. Your voice or your phone line is like the front door for your business for a lot of your customers. So want to make sure that as we're having those, high performing task success, and as we're handling that containment rate, limiting handovers as much as we can, that we're not also having a really poor experience for the user. And one thing I think about a lot with the user experience is like the voice that they're hearing, right? So like it's so huge, like I can hear TV commercials in my head around like this is that voice of the brand for me. And I know you guys think about this a lot too, where it's like when you're picking a voice, that's going to be kind of your personality for your brand when they call in. How do you think about like an open versus kind of integrated way, and how folks should be thinking around like their voice selection?
It's a great question. So one thing, there's a couple of choices that need to be made here. And one of them is, are you gonna go integrate or OpenStack, of course. And the other one is, are you gonna clone your own voices versus are you gonna use something out of box? I can tell you from having done thousands of voices, sourcing a great voice is surprisingly difficult. You need to get the right voice actor, you need to get the right set of transcripts, you need to get them in the right setting, you need to record it, you need to test, you need to do post-processing, etc., all of those things. It is something that, if you're like a big company, it's definitely something that you will have to do to kind of develop your identity around it. If you're a smaller company, you usually want to get started from something that is out of box. And in that regime, like actually, it's quite a big of a commitment if you think about it. You put a voice, your stakeholders, be that your customers or somebody internal, are actually kind of they're bought into that voice. Besides everything else that you're doing, they're bought into that voice. And there are some platforms that their whole model is only available in that platform. So you can end up being in a situation where the voice locks you into the platform, which is difficult. So those are things that are all to be considered. Do you want to clone your own voice, or do you want to use a prepackaged voice? Different considerations to each one of those.
Sure. And like again, I'll use my TV commercial example. Like when they kill off the main speaker of a brand, you know what I mean? Like suddenly Jake from State Farm's gone. It's like, oh no, like well, where did my connection with the brand go? And I think the same thing can be said on voice. I want to just kind of get one or two more questions to you before we head over to Q&A. You mentioned voice cloning, and certainly like we've done some of that. We've done some of that with you. We've had some customers, or many customers, I guess I should say, do it kind of between the two of us. But like if I'm a customer or if I'm a brand right now and I want to like get started with voice cloning, like you mentioned specific transcript, finding the right voice, like what are some questions I should be asking, or how should I be getting prepared for that?
Yeah, let me actually address the most common misconception about it, because we think about when you think about voice, people think about like, oh, like if I record 10 seconds myself, that I can just kind of clone myself and speak in all different kind of situations. The reality is that with these models, it's not just the timbre of your voice and how it sounds, but it's also how you speak. So obviously in a webinar setting, we're speaking differently than in this is actually like a conversational thing, but in a presentation, you speak differently. Imagine kind of like a coach's halftime speech. There's a ton of like, ethos to it. Like it speaks in a very certain way, as opposed to reading out some words. And all of those, like what we call like prosody characteristics that you do as you clone the voice, are going to carry over into the voice. So the voice is not just like, oh, how it sounds to my ear. It is all these characteristics. So you have to think about all of this. Like what is the context? I remember like sitting in like in a customer contact like call center, and you could hear one call center person was, we've heard him call center setting, and then they got a call from family. They picked up the phone, and it's as if it was a different person. So those, like, when you have to really think about the use case and how you want it to sound in that use case specifically, and do your kind of cloning at that level. So, and again, now you're doing it via voice actor, so you have to actually kind of prompt them to do it really well. And we've seen like some sophisticated customer, really sophisticated strategies on how to get the voice actor to do it exactly like that, because it's very non-trivial.
Interesting. Yeah. And I know one thing, our customers do quite a bit of testing with the voices and like measuring conversion rate and customer satisfaction on that. It's an area that honestly, coming into this, I kind of maybe passed over or didn't fully understand the importance of, like, yeah, of course your user base is going to resonate with more than, with one voice over the other. Is there anything you see from like voice selection by use case, or anything like when you're picking a voice maybe off the rack and not cloning that customers should think about, like male versus female, picking different accents, like what works best, or is it just you have to test with your audience?
Always best test with the audience, I would say. We do see a gravitation towards female. Somebody in the chat mentioned that nailing the right, especially for female voice, it ends up being quite difficult, kind of finding the right balance between assertive and kind of like helpful. It is a tough balance. And yeah, like testing is a good idea. Like finding the set of candidates to test is always a good idea. One thing I would say is, for people, rather than the biggest tip I can give here is, like, rather than speaking to it, listening to it in like a generation over generation, like playing the play button, actually set up an agent and talk to it. Just like on your way home, just set up if you were to decide between A and B, just have like a 10-minute conversation with each one of them. We humans have our brains wired really, really well to have a conversation, as opposed to pressing a play button multiple times and coming up with random transcripts.
Yeah, and I think like you'll find kind of some of the nuance in that voice, not after the first snippet of like, generated text, but like as you're 6-7 turns into the conversation. I want to turn it over to Q&A here in just 1 second, but before I do that, like anything on the Cartesia side is that you want to cover? Any, if I'm just jumping into Cartesia, kind of what should I maybe start building with, or where should I start looking?
Yeah, I mean, Cartesia.ai, you can just get starting is free. You can take, we've been experimenting with some cool stuff recently. You can always check our change log to see what we've been up to. We've been cooking for the last few months and have some exciting stuff on the pipe.
Cool. Excited to hear it. So let me turn over to the Q&A. And before I do that, I want to maybe just recap a bit of the discussion that we had today. So look, there is an honest case for like when an integrated stack is going to be better, right? I think it offers these pros of like an out-of-the-box solution, very few, if not only one vendor contract to manage. You can have extreme vertical depth with like your specific use case, but you then may end up locked into a specific vendor's either model roadmap or their own models. When there's one weakness in the layer, you try to like scale that out and you can't optimize the transcriber, or you can't swap in a multi-language, ASR. That may be a kind of signal for when it's time to upgrade into something that's a bit more open. Again, on that kind of modular side, I think some of the pros here, and this is kind of the VAPI Cartesia mix, is you're able to upgrade at any layer without having to migrate your entire stack. At each step of that cascade, again, the speech to text, LLM, text to speech, we offer that kind of best fit for each, and you're able to kind of optimize and fine tune some of those different layers. Bringing in new models as they ship, again, whenever has something exciting in the changelog, it'll be there for you in VAPI. But of course, it comes with more vendors to coordinate, put a higher upfront architectural investment, but something that does offer a bit more durability and long lasting. So with that, let me turn it over to the Q&A. I've been trying to keep up with the questions here and monitoring them. Got a lot of exciting ones. Let me just take one look here. And I think the first one I'll talk about is the question around what role should I consider using VAPI in an OpenStack architecture? So great question. Again, when you think about VAPI, think about us as the plumbing and infrastructure behind that speech to text, LLM, and voice, right? So pulling in all the different models together and offering you levers to pull and test different ones within your single agent building experience. So the kind of plumbing and the connection between all of those different models, whether it's something from Cartesia or whether you're using an OpenAI or an Anthropic LLM or your transcriber of choice, making sure that you have a single place to pull all those in together and have the plumbing work. Question around, is Cartesia Sonic already built into the VAPI agents? Yes, so fully built in. I think, again, as I mentioned, Cartesia's been a kind of partner since day one of building in VAPI. So, I have hundreds of customers kind of building on top of Sonic 3 or any latest models that is in the team are cooking up there. But as I said, you can get started, bring in your API key, or just start using VAPI with that today. Just taking a look at some of the questions here. Yeah, so I mentioned VAPI squads earlier. So there's a question around explaining what VAPI squads are. What's the best model to use squads? So squads allows you to organize like a multi-agent architecture. So I think the example I mentioned is like you may have a call answering agent who routes to different agents based on specific tasks. In my example, before, you may want to optimize those agents for certain tasks and have kind of higher intelligence or higher powered models handle some more complex tasks that have a higher cost. But some easier tasks, FAQs, basic, what time is your business open, can be handled by like a lower cost model if these business economics are really important to you at the scale that you're operating in. Cool. Let me just pop over the question. It's flooded, so I'm trying to get to as many of them as I can.
One I guess.
Yeah, go ahead. Jump in there.
What does harness mean in this context? I'd say harness, for instance, Claude Code is a harness for Opus to do coding tasks. It's the code that around a different model to make sure that the models are doing what you want to do. And people often talk about eval harness, which is like how do you have like a certain piece of code that takes just as an input the API key, the model ID, etc., and runs the entire eval on it, and you can kind of swap out the model. So it's any sort of environment where you can swap out different models, and so in some extent we call it like orchestration, but they can call the agent frameworks also are kind of agent harnesses.
Yeah, great one. One thing I may have saw this in the chat, but we've of course talked about kind of the standard 3-step voice pipeline. But what about speech to speech? What are you guys kind of seeing there from a model standpoint?
Oh, you spoke to my heart. We really do believe in speech to speech as like the long term of where this is going. I think it's going to come actually sooner than we think. I had a prediction in a different fireside. It was that right now I would say like 95% of the voice agent calls are getting done over a cascade system. I think that's going to go by this time next year for sure. It's going to be more in the like 70% regime as opposed to like overwhelming thing. And I think it's going to be slowly at first and then all of a sudden. So that's kind of the future of it. Today, in contrast, we find that like it's incredibly difficult to get a control of the speech-to-speech system to actually deliver on the results that you need. And so we are like, again, it's a very, very small percentage. It's usually for things more like companion, where the transactional nature and the accuracy and the transcript following, etc., it doesn't matter as much. So not something that is available for broad use, I would say, today, but definitely something to continue keeping an eye out.
Yeah, that tracks with what we're seeing too. And, we support some of the GPT real-time models. I think where it starts to fall apart in production is some of that tool calling. And, I say fall apart. These are still insane technological developments that we've had in this. So, it does feel like we're quite close to it. But I also think we have this view that, it will never be one or the other. It can live as a combination, right? And in certain cases, maybe you have one agent that answers the phone speech to speech, hands off to another, or another agent's doing the work in the background and bringing it over. So will be really interesting to see how this shakes out. There's one question maybe for you here. is around Cartesia's sonic model is known for low latency. What's the practical flaw you're seeing in real production deployments, not just text-to-speech in isolation?
Yeah, what's the concrete what?
Kind of like the real production deployments, like end-to-end. What are you seeing time there? I think this goes back to what we said around.
Oh, yeah.
It's a multi-step process.
It really depends on the agent harness. For people who have like a really, really tight thing configured, then it can go all the way down to like a 1 second, I would say, area, or even below. Like that's people who've done it like really, really tight. And of course, the latency envelope includes multiple things. A big part of it is actually turn taking on the STT side, which is something that we are thinking about as well. But yeah, like only of that like second, of that like 800 milliseconds, we try to contribute as little as possible to it. And on like kind of we on the P95, we try to stay under 150, etc. But yeah, like our P50s, like both on P50 and P99, like we are the best of the class. So
yeah, and like we said before, it's all what happens in that full pipeline together too, right? So like that P95 is amazing, but if you've picked a frontier model for your LLM and have 6 tools being called with it, of course that is going to affect the perceived latency turn by turn. But I would say we regularly see customers with sub 1 second, sub 800 milliseconds using Sonic 3 and other providers as kind of the standard for turn latency. Let me just jump into, here's a great one. Is there any floor on latency like below when a human can hardly hear or perceive any difference? I know we have thoughts on this, but what do you see is around like at what point does latency just become like kind of irrelevant if it's sub 200?
I think we are, I would say for truly natural conversation, I think we're actually quite far from the floor. So like I have two answers. Like for natural conversation, we're actually quite far from the floor. The natural conversation, if you actually go and measure people who are talking, what is the amount of like silence between their two speeches, it is 100 milliseconds on average, end to end. And doing things like backchanneling and whatnot. So like to get to truly pass the human Turing test, actually it's quite a bit. If you want to, but if you look at it from like what's good enough, from like when does it come? When does the point come where people are not willing to engage with it? I think if you have a conversation with a competent voice agent, but it takes you 2 seconds to do the round trip, I think people are forgiving enough. And that's the state of play right now. What I also predict is that as the other voice agents become better, like it'll be a race essentially. As the others improve their voice agents and their latency, all of a sudden what was acceptable today is going to stop being acceptable from a customer standpoint.
Yeah, and sometimes the benchmark is like how better is it at solving the problem versus a human, right? And if I'm on a call with a customer support agent and it takes me 15 minutes, I may not care if my agent does it in 3 minutes, but has a 1 or 2 second turn latency. Again, some of this is around like the actual human outcomes that you're driving and just how much better are those than what the status quo was before. So of course, like we see tons of customers optimizing and we want to optimize for that low latency. And that's the kind of where the bulk of our work is done too. But I think sometimes stepping out of us as builders and us as like technologists trying to optimize everything, sometimes just like getting it right is the most important thing. And I think, never want to lose sight of that either.
I think somebody asked a very simple question, which is how do I use Cartesia with BAPI? Yeah, you want to take that, Nick?
I mean, maybe I'll just flash this last slide here. So jump into either of these platforms today. You can just hop over to dashboard of Vapi AI or just Vapi AI and kind of log in, create an account. Like I mentioned, Cartesia, one of the preferred voice providers, also offers some stuff around ASR and transcription, but I know voice is where you guys really shine. So simple drop down, pick Cartesia, pick your favorite voice from that. How do folks get started in Cartesia there is?
Yeah, the Cartesia AI, as I said, you can be in the playground. You can get started with the API really quickly too. Pick a voice, start generating with it, and find your favorite voice and start using it.
Yeah, and I know we're running just up on time here, so I think I'll probably stop the Q&A there. We have the whole list of questions along with the actual answers, so can make sure that we review these, make sure that we either get back to you or we clear how to do some of this stuff in VAPI or Cartesia. But I just wanted to say thanks so much for having the chat with me today, man. I learned a lot. I hope the audience learned a lot too.
Same here, Nick. It's been a pleasure.
Make your browser fast. Make your browser safe. Make your browser Chrome.